We are in the book of Haggai, and we're wrapping up today. And if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn there. Haggai is the third to last book in the Old Testament. It's only really 2 chapters, so it's very short, easy to miss. But if you find Zechariah, it is immediately before Zechariah. Haggai was a prophet for God in Israel during a period when Israel was coming back into the land after being exiled and really led captive. And so there's a very fascinating backstory, and I'll cover a little bit of that with you this morning to kind of reset where we are, and then as we look at this last and final message of Haggai, understand what God is doing in this period of history. But before I get there, I want to ask you, how many of y'all can remember 3D posters? They were also called stereograms. If you were alive in the 90s, like I was kind of in my teenage years in the 90s, I remember seeing these posters all over the place. I got one here, and inevitably, for those of you who are younger, you might not have ever seen something like this, but it's a 3D poster. And when 3D posters were kind of first coming out, all the 3D technology, it was awesome. It was cool. It was the latest and greatest trend or fad. And you could walk into a bookstore or a Christian bookstore, and I remember going into different businesses and bookstores, or even Walmart had these hanging up, and you would see a group of people staring at it, and the goal was to see the hidden image that was actually in there. Now, the trick is you had to kind of defocus your eyes, not on the immediate layer that was there, but you kind of had to look through it. And inevitably, if there was a crowd of people that was there, one person in the crowd would all of a sudden say, I see it, and everybody else would be like, shh, we don't want you to ruin it for us. And so if you were to dislocate your eyes somehow and look through this today, inevitably there would be a couple of crosses, and I believe an empty tomb that's there, but you can't see it unless you really do spend some time really trying to think through, looking through it. And the reason I bring up the stereograms today, the 3D images, is because when we approach the scriptures, especially when it comes to prophecy, much of what we have to do is very similar to what we have to do to that 3D poster. You kind of have to look through what the object is that's right in front of you to truly see the hidden picture that's the greater reality of what's actually there. And it's kind of hidden in plain sight. It's something that when you look at it and you see it, all of a sudden you realize there's excitement in really seeing the true picture, and you want other people to see it. And so today where we are, with the final speech that Haggai gives, we are going to see really one of these stereograms, so to speak, in the pages of the Bible, where we kind of see what's presented in front of us, but the author, and certainly God, wants us to look through that initial image and see the true hidden picture that is there for us to behold. And so when we read today, I want you to reflect on what is being read. And let me kind of give you the reset, because the book of Haggai ends with this type of a 3D picture, this type of a stereogram for us to wrestle with. So let me give you the quick reset of where we've been so you can remember what's going on. The people of Israel are coming back into the promised land. The northern kingdom was defeated, and it was kind of conquered. The southern kingdom was conquered as well in 586 BC. And so as the northern kingdom was led into exile and the southern kingdom was led into captivity, there was a period for many years where Israel was dislocated, so to speak, from the land. They were not in the land. The temple was destroyed, which is where they worshiped the Lord. And then 60 some odd years later, some of the early waves of people begin to come back. And so in the early period of Israel returning to the promised land, you had the books of Ezra and Nehemiah when they begin building the walls and they begin laying the foundation for the temple. And as we picked up the text in Haggai, at Haggai's point, there's really 3 key characters that are identified in the speeches, and we've seen 3 speeches so far. The first speech took place in August, and God said, it's time for you to start rebuilding my house. You keep saying it's not time yet, it's not time yet, it's not time yet. And God says, is it time for you to live in your nice homes while you've neglected the only place that I can occupy, which is the temple? And so the people repent, and not just the people, but there's actually 3 people that are given that first speech. There's Zerubbabel, who's a civic leader. He's kind of the political leader for Israel at that point. There's also Joshua, who's a high priest at that point. And then, not the Joshua that you remember from Moses and Joshua, is a very distant Joshua, separated by several centuries here. But there's another Joshua on the scene now. He's the high priest. And then there's the people. So there's three key figures. Then the second message comes to the people and Zerubbabel and Joshua through Haggai as God speaks through him in the second speech. And the second speech takes place a little bit later. It takes place in October. And so we saw the second speech that took place, and kind of Zerubbabel and the people and Joshua were there, and Haggai said, "How does the temple look to you? After all this time you spent working on it, it looks like a bunch of hot nothing." And so then the word of the Lord came back a third time, and the third time it came back in December of that year, 520 BC. So kind of three speeches so far, and we're now following the third speech. In the third speech, the Lord is affirming that everything these people have done for him is really unclean, unacceptable, because they are an unclean people, and everything they touch gets contaminated because of their uncleanliness. And so God says, you need to be purified, and it's nothing you can do. It's something only I can bring. And so the people are there, and of course, they are wanting to please the Lord. They're wanting to build the temple. But God concludes the third speech with an unusual line. He says, "From this day forward, I will bless you." Now, picture in your mind the message of God coming through Haggai to really those three key people, all of the people really, and then Zerubbabel and Joshua. And three times there's been three speeches, and each of those speeches has been directed to those three audience figures. But as this third speech wraps up, we get a sense that maybe the people begin to leave. Maybe Joshua says, "Okay, I've got some work to do." And maybe Zerubbabel turns from Haggai and he begins to leave. But just at that moment, the word of the Lord comes again. The exact same day as the third speech, and perhaps just a few moments afterwards, Haggai gets Zerubbabel. He says, "Zerubbabel, do not leave yet. God has a fourth and final message for me to give to you, and it's only for you alone." So let's turn to Haggai, Haggai chapter 2, and we're going to look at this final speech in the closing verses. The closing verses are verses 20 through 23. Haggai chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. Here is what Haggai records. "Then the word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah, saying, I am going to shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overthrow the thrones of kingdoms and destroy the power of the kingdoms of the nations. And I will overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and their riders will go down, everyone by the sword of another." Verse 23 says, "On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares the Lord, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts." May God bless the reading of his word this morning. This fourth and final speech wraps up the book of Haggai. This is how the book of Haggai ends, and we are left to question, well, what in the world is going on with this fourth and final speech? What is God interested in? Who is this guy, Zerubbabel? Because now we have a speech that's dedicated exclusively for Zerubbabel. The previous three speeches have been to everyone who's been present, but now we have a fourth and final speech. And God, through the prophet Haggai, gives a very unique presentation in the speeches of the little book here in this final one. This particular speech is given to Zerubbabel, and it's the final message of the book. It's only for him and him alone, and all the other speeches for the people and the high priest and for Zerubbabel were beneficial for the community at large, but now this one is for Zerubbabel alone. And it comes the exact same day as that third speech that we mentioned previously. And I wonder kind of what Zerubbabel's face might have been when he turned and realized that Haggai was done with everybody else, but he's not done with me. It's almost as if Zerubbabel got Haggai to tap him on the shoulder and say, "Hey, Zerubbabel, God's not finished with you yet." Well, let's talk about Zerubbabel real quick. Who is this individual? He's a kind of a lesser-known character in the Old Testament, but when we begin to really examine what's going on, we realize he is a significant character, a very significant character, especially in this book, but not just that, in the greater picture of what God is doing through the Old Testament. Haggai calls him the governor of Judah. We've seen that already here in the book of Haggai. He was a political leader in the post-exilic community. He comes from a line of kings. In 1 Chronicles chapter 3, we find that he's actually a descendant of King David. Yes, the same David who killed Goliath. Yes, the same David who was Israel's greatest king. The David who God approached, and he made this promise to in 2 Samuel chapter 7. If you remember how God came to David and he made promises to David, this is one that was significant. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 says this, and this is God speaking to David. God says to David, "When your days are complete, and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men, but my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house, David, and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne shall be established forever." Man, isn't that a powerful promise from God? That David's descendants will never, ever fail, that there will be a Davidic kingdom that will last perpetually before the Lord. So here is Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and God says to him, "Zerubbabel, I have chosen you." Now that gives us a little bit more information, but let's continue to dig here, because we find that in this letter, in this book that Haggai records, Zerubbabel is not a king. In fact, he's really a puppet figure for the Persian Empire. If you look at what's going on here, the Persian Empire has really conquered the known world at that point. They've been sending people back from captivity into the various areas where they would live, and they set them up almost as puppet regents, saying, "You're really not in control. We're still exercising dominance over you, and so therefore, we'll give you some freedom to do some self-governing, but it's all under our thumb." And that was the picture of Zerubbabel here. And so if you look at his name, Zerubbabel, it literally translates to the offspring of Babylon. The offspring of Babylon. Now, who is the big shot during this time? Who is the true powerful king at this point in history? The answer is actually found in this book of Haggai. The real powerful guy is actually, his name is Darius. He's the king of Persia at this point. Darius is large and in charge, and if you read other prophets from the Old Testament, what's fascinating is the other prophets will date their books off of Israel's kings. In the year of whatever king it was, the king of the north, the king of the south, but here in Haggai, who is Haggai dating it off of? He's dating it off of Darius, the king of Persia. And all this is taking place really in front of Zerubbabel, and I wonder if Zerubbabel might be a little bit embarrassed, realizing that all of the other prophets are recording their writings off of the kings of Israel, and here's Haggai dating his writing off of Darius. You see, Zerubbabel was not powerful enough or influential enough to even have Haggai date his book off of his tenure as the civic leader or the political figure in Jerusalem at this point. If you look at 1 verse 1, here's what Haggai says. In the second year of King Darius, on the first day of the 6th month. If you look at 1:15 into 2 verse 1, the second year of King Darius, on the 21st day of the 7th month. Chapter 2 verse 10, on the 24th day of the 9th month, in the second year of Darius. Over and over, Darius, 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 Darius. Why am I stressing this? I'm stressing this because I want you to see this guy Zerubbabel for who he is. He's not an alpha dog. He's not the big shot. He's not large and in charge. There's no doubt that this is a bit humiliating. Most scholars would conclude that. Some people might be looking to him and realizing, man, you're the descendant of David. You should be the one who's getting us back in line. You should be the one that's doing this. But Zerubbabel looks around and he says, well, based on the external realities around me, based on the external comparisons of who I am in light of the world scene, I'm just kind of small right now. I don't have a big power behind me. I don't have all the resources. I don't have the position. But we also find that there's not just the external challenges that he's facing, but there's also internal challenges that he's facing. You see, if you look at Jeremiah, we find Zerubbabel's grandfather actually was really not the greatest guy. Zerubbabel's grandfather was a wicked Judean king. His name was Jeconiah, and he was judged by God. In fact, it was God who judged Jeconiah, which led to the captivity. So imagine this for a minute. Not only are you having really the world stage and you're being compared to the world stage as a leader for your people, but now you realize I've got really shame and embarrassment because of my family and my family's activities. My grandfather was the one who really led to everyone getting booted from the land. Look at Jeremiah chapter 22, verses 24 through 26. I want you to think about who this guy Zerubbabel is and what's going on in his heart. Jeremiah 22, 24 to 26, God says this as his judgment against his grandfather. He says, as I live, declares the Lord, even though Coniah, this is Jeconiah, his grandfather, Coniah, the son of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, were a signet ring on my right hand, yet I would pull him off. I don't want anything to do with this guy anymore, says the Lord. He says, I'm going to give you over into the hand of those who are seeking your life, yes, into the hand of those whom you dread, even to the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, into the hand of the Chaldeans. Verse 26, I'm going to hurl you and your mama. That's how much of a deal this was to God. I'm going to hurl you and your mama, who bore you into another country where you are not from, and there you will die. Here's Zerubbabel. Who is this guy, Zerubbabel? Hopefully you're starting to get a picture of who he is. On the world stage, he's kind of a small fry. And internally, knowing his own family background, there's shame and embarrassment. I'm not sure if you've ever been put in a position of leadership, and when people are looking at you, or maybe you're looking at yourself and you're thinking, what can I do? There's too much outside that's really, when compared to what I have and what my skills are and what I've been entrusted right now, it's just too big of a challenge. And not only that, but I'm coming in from really a legacy of something that's shameful in the near history of what my family has done. And here is Zerubbabel. He's insignificant to the foreign rulers and powers, and he's coming from failure in his own family. But I want you to hear what God says to him, because this message becomes such a beautiful thing when you realize what God is doing. God says, hey, Zerubbabel, wait a second. I'm not done with you yet. Everybody else is leaving, but God says, I have one more message, and it's specifically for you, Zerubbabel. I'm not finished with you yet. You might be small to those who are on the outside. You might be wrestling with failure from within, but here's what God says. He says, Zerubbabel, it's not you who's going to shake the heavens and the earth. I will shake the heavens and the earth, says God. I am going to overthrow thrones of kingdoms. I am going to destroy the power of nations. I am going to overthrow chariots and riders and horses, and they're all going to fall before me. And on that day, says God, I am going to take you, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares the Lord, I am going to make you like a signet ring because I have chosen you. Your grandfather, I removed from my hand as a signet ring. I cast him aside, him and his mama, and I got rid of him because of his wickedness and his rejection of me. But you, Zerubbabel, I am taking you and I am putting you back on. Signet ring. What's a signet ring? How many Aggies we got in the house who's got an Aggie ring right now. Yeah, all you guys, yeah. Rings carry significance. They show you different things. They show you the groups that you belong to. They show you kind of your authority. Hopefully, if there's a year on your ring, you actually finished all your classes that year. Some of you might not have, but hopefully all of you did. And that shows that there's something conveyed to you at that point. And rings, even in marriage, show that we belong to someone special. A signet ring in the ancient world was held by a ruling authority. It would have distinctive markings on it. It was often used to verify different legal documents or edicts that would go out. If there was something that was written and then sealed, it would be impressed into wax, and that way when you looked at the impression that was there, you realized this is authoritative. This is the real deal. And so the signet ring for God was God's divine selection to say, you are going to carry forth my authority. You will represent me. And God says to Zerubbabel, I am selecting you and I am putting you back on. Man, that's an awesome thing, isn't it? When you see what just happened with his grandparents, his great-grandparents, here's the Lord saying, Zerubbabel, I'm not finished with you yet. God is telling him, I removed the signet ring with your grandfather because of his disobedience, and I sent him and his mom and the rest of Israel, all of Judah, into captivity, but I'm putting you back on. And so you have my authority. Be strong. I am with you. From this day on, I will bless you. Now, the text doesn't give us Zerubbabel's response. I wonder kind of what his response would have been. The book of Haggai concludes before we see any response from Zerubbabel, but I have a suspicion, and I don't know whether this is correct or not, this is conjecture, but I suspect that Zerubbabel's response was, I am your servant. Here's a guy who's not big, he's not a large and in charge individual, but I suspect that he has the proper response because of God's heart to him, and also what we see not just from Haggai, but do you know that sometimes the Bible writers, those who give us these books, live at the same time as others who write the Bible. One of Haggai's contemporaries was a prophet named Zechariah. Zechariah also wrote as God gave instruction to him, and he actually writes specifically regarding Zerubbabel. Look at Zechariah chapter 4, starting in verse 6. And here is what God says through Zechariah. Here is the word of the Lord. Zechariah records, Then he said to me, This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit. How many of you guys have heard that verse before? How many of you realize that was for Zerubbabel? Yeah, we put it on coffee mugs, and we put it on calendars, and we put it on thank you notes and things like that. It's one of those verses that gets plastered all over the place. Do you realize this is for Zerubbabel? Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord of hosts. What are you, verse 7? What are you, O great mountain, before Zerubbabel? You're going to become like a plain, and he's going to bring forth from the top stone with the shouts of grace, grace to it. And the word of the Lord came to me, says Zechariah, saying, The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house, and his hands will finish it. Then you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you. For who has despised the day of the small things? And how many of you can think about that? Like, here are the people looking at the temple like it's a bunch of hot nothing. And Zechariah is like, don't despise the day of small things. You don't realize it looks small right now. It looks insignificant, but you don't realize what's being done and accomplished. Don't despise the day of small things. These 7 will be glad when they see the plumb line in the hand of Zerubbabel. These are the eyes of the Lord, which range to and fro throughout the earth. Now, if you recognize that phrase, the eyes of the Lord, which range to and fro throughout the earth, you might have another verse that kind of pops into your head. And I had that happen to me this week because I was like, I know there's another verse. And I began to reflect and look at it. 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9. The eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully fixed upon him. And so how does Zerubbabel respond when God says, Zerubbabel, don't go anywhere. I'm not done with you just yet. I suspect Zerubbabel says, I am your servant. Because the eyes of the Lord are searching back and forth through the earth to find those whose hearts are fixed upon him. And he wants to strengthen them. And here is Zerubbabel, and he's saying, Zerubbabel, be strong, I am with you. Keep building. From this day forward, I will bless you. I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. I'm going to overthrow thrones and kingdoms. I'm going to destroy the powers of nations. I will overthrow chariots and riders and horses. They're all going to fall before me. And I will take you, Zerubbabel, my servant, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you. Here's Zerubbabel, singled out in the final message from the Lord, not just as a key player for the reconstruction of the temple, but also the future of David's kingdom. And in Matthew chapter 1, when we see the genealogy of Jesus, and Matthew records the genealogy of Jesus, in verse 12, he picks it up really from the period of the exile and the captivity generation. And it says, after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah became the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abihud, Abihud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Eliud, Eliud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Mathan, Mathan the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary by whom Jesus was born, who is called Messiah. See, if you want to see the hidden picture, you got to look beyond what's right in front of you, defocus your eyes a little bit, and look through. And what God is saying is that, Zerubbabel, you are going to play such a key role in revealing the true picture of what I'm bringing. Because through you, Zerubbabel, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ, will come. The family of Joseph is going to be traced through you. And this message that Haggai brings to us, when we wrestle with it, we'll say, well, what is there for us now, and what should we be wrestling with as God's people in the 21st century? I would argue that when we look at this really picture in this scene, here we have an individual who is small and he's insignificant and he's got failure in his background, yet God is willing to do something profound through him. We are not Zerubbabel. But church, does God still do something amazing with those who are broken and humble before him? Absolutely. And when I look at what's going on here, you might say, well, Jerusalem's in ruins, it's tattered, the temple is desolate, it's even their attempts to rebuild it just don't look very good. I mean, Zechariah says, don't despise the day of small things. So these are the days of small things. What can God really do through us as a group? I believe the message that Haggai records that is timeless for us to wrestle with is simply this: that God's glory, God's temple, and God's king will not be denied. God's glory, God's temple, and God's king will not be denied. And all three of those things are summed up in the final permanent temple that Revelation captures, when really God the Father and Jesus Christ are the temple. God's glory, God's temple, and God's king will not be denied. Regardless of how big the outside obstacles appear or even the internal embarrassments seem, God's glory, God's temple, and God's king will not be denied. Church, Jesus is coming. For Zerubbabel, he was coming for the first time still, but for us, he's coming back. And Jesus is the greater Zerubbabel, God's chosen servant, his signet ring. And Jesus is going to establish a greater temple, not just in the sacrifice of his own body, but as the nations come in glory and present to him the riches, he will receive the greater glory. And the lesson for us is not that we are Zerubbabel, but we are the church. We are now living in anticipation of that day when God's going to shake the heavens and the earth, and we will be receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Therefore, the writer of Hebrews tells us this: to be thankful and to worship God with acceptable reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. But you might think, well, what we're doing is so small. John, it's so insignificant in the big picture. And I would say no. Zechariah said, don't despise the day of small things, because God has great plans for the temple, and that is still to come. You might feel like we're small right now, and you might feel like you're small right now, and what God's doing with you is small right now. You might feel even embarrassed from maybe something in your life or something that you came from. But God's not finished with you yet. So be strong and build. Look at the lessons from Haggai. God's with you just as he was with the people in Jerusalem. He desires to bless today simple obedience just like he did thousands of years ago. And the true and permanent temple is just ahead.